Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning in Japan, good evening here in the United States. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President and I run the Economics Program at CSIS, a think tank in Washington. We're delighted to welcome you to this event on Global Networks 2030. We're going to be launching, or we did launch today, a few hours ago, a new report on this topic, and we're here to have a discussion about the report and about the issues that are discussed in the report. And we have a terrific panel of experts to speak in just a few minutes. But and then there will be, after I ask them a few questions back and forth, we will invite audience questions, and you can submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button on your screen and then ask a question there. So with that, I am going to get started and just make a few words of introduction. So everyone has heard about 5G now, the fifth generation of telecommunications systems that is a big topic of interest around the world, including for us here at CSIS. The story has some features that people don't understand or are exaggerated, including about the role of Chinese companies, particularly Huawei, and its emergence. Clearly, it is a leading supplier of this next generation technology, and that has created a kind of an impulse in the United States and Japan and other countries to look at the competitiveness of their participation in these networks and at national security related concerns around these networks. So there is a big competition going on about who is going to design, build, set the standards for these telecommunications networks. China is using a lot of different tools, investments at home, also through its Belt and Road initiative and the related Digital Silk Road initiative. It is pushing out this new form of telecommunications infrastructure, and that is creating a real competition and interest here. A couple of years ago at CSIS, we put out a report of a task force on global infrastructure. The report was called The Higher Road, and you can find it if you Google CSIS The Higher Road. I think you'll find it. And we talked about the stakes for the United States in particular in this global infrastructure story are especially high in the digital domain. So this is a topic that we've been interested in for a couple of years. It's going to be critical to jobs, to economic growth, and to national security. So we think this is a very important set of developments. And as we've seen in history, these networks, including in information and communications networks, even going back to ancient Rome or ancient China, have been related to, of course, growth, military capability, and intelligence. So there's a lot at stake here that we're going to discuss tonight or this morning, and to help policymakers here and in Japan prepare for these changes, we have put together this report, which my colleague John Hillman, who's going to be one of the speakers tonight, wrote with a colleague on this topic called Global Networks 2030, and that report just came out, and I think it's on your screen if you want to download it. You can read it. So before I turn to the speakers and start the discussion, I just want to thank the sponsors of this event. First of all, Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, and Mitsubishi UFJ Research and Consulting Company for supporting this work. We couldn't do anything at CSIS without the support of our sponsors, and we very much appreciate that support. Thank you also to the many, many experts who John and others here at CSIS consulted through roundtables and other discussions including people from some of the companies developing these technologies. So we're very grateful to all of that expertise, which has really helped us produce a much better report. So thank you. Okay, with that, let me get our speakers into the conversation. So we're delighted to be joined by three terrific speakers. One is Ken Watanabe, who is Director General of the Global Strategy Bureau at Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication. So he'll be our the first person I'm going to ask a question to, but let me just introduce the other two speakers. Ms. Diane Rinaldo is Executive Director of the OpenRAN Policy Coalition, and she's going to explain later what OpenRAN means. But we're delighted to have Diane back with us again. She's been a regular at CSIS and delighted to have Diane with us again. And then finally, my colleague, John Hillman, who is Senior Fellow and Director of our Reconnecting Asia project at CSIS. He's also author of a terrific book on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which you can just see over his left shoulder, The Emperor's New Road, which is available at your favorite bookstore or online. So with that, I'm going to turn to you first, Watanabe-san, and ask you, because 5G is something that Japan has been very focused on for some time now. Can you give us an overview of how you are thinking about and acting on 5G development in Japan? And then we'll go from there. Dozo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goodman, for your overview and kind introduction of me. First, I would like to express my appreciation to CSIS for hosting several series of roundtables and compiling insightful report, and having me today with distinguished guest, Ms. Rinaldo. As for the ICT policy, which Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, my ministry, MIC, covers, Japan has been making various collaborative efforts with the U.S., sharing a commitment to free and open Indo-Pacific. And to realize the initiative, it is essential to develop ICT infrastructure and services globally, ensuring the security and promoting the openness, because it becomes indispensable infrastructure and source of new value creation. And 5G is one of the most vital issues. Japan would like to work together with the US. So as a start of discussion, as I instructed, I will share the recent 5G network policy of Japan regarding the security and OpenRAN. In Japan, commercial use of 5G has started since about a year ago, and the government has been encouraging private sectors on acceleration of the development and creation of the various use cases. At the same time, government conducted policy to ensure security in 5G networks. And we require telecommunication operators to take necessary cybersecurity measures as one of conditions for frequency assignment. And in addition, about tax incentive for accelerating deployment, we examine the 5G system from the viewpoint of safety, reliability, supply stability, and openness. And only the certified 5G system are eligible for them. Also, we have been putting efforts on R&D and international standardization to realize the secure networks. And we'll continue to implement both regulative and promotional approaches to firmly ensuring security of the networks. In addition, we share the concern of security risks caused by the issue of vendor lock-in. We are promoting the open and interoperable 5G networks architecture together with private sectors, and there are challenging aspects in structuring and operating the network comprised of devices from multiple vendors. So Japanese government has been implementing various promotional measures. As I mentioned, openness is set as one of the requirements for tax incentives. Multi-vendor interconnectivity and interoperability of the systems are ensured by means such as interface specification designated by OpenRAN Alliance, which consists of major telecom companies and vendors in the world. And as for R&D, MIC launched a project to reduce the time and cost on OpenRAN interoperability testing. And MIT also encouraged the establishment of the Open Test and Integration Center Japan among operators and vendors. And since it's difficult to develop and deploy secure and open 5G by respective efforts of a country, international public and private cooperation is crucial. As a government, we are strengthening cooperation with other countries through conducting bilateral policy discussion and offering to support experimental or pilot project on the introduction of secure and open 5G models. Japan also started to think about international collaboration for beyond 5G towards 2030. And finally, in order to collaborate between Japan and the US in digital field, bilateral policy dialogue have been held mainly by MIC in Japan and the State Department in the US. And we have been working closely with US government, including also NTIA, FCC, USAID on 5G openness and security. And we'd like to further deepen our collaboration with the US new administration. For that, I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that overview. You mentioned ORAN in passing, and I'm going to let Diane in a minute talk more about that, as I mentioned, but you also mentioned something in passing about beyond 5G. What does that mean, and what are your ideas for going beyond 5G? We haven't even implemented 5G fully, but we're already going beyond it. What are your basic thoughts about that?
Thank you for your question. MIC actually announced the Beyond 5G promotion strategy last June to realize it by 2030. And it shows expectation for society in 2030s and defines the necessary new function of beyond 5G, such as ultra-low power consumption or ultra security and resiliency. And it consists of three strategies on R&D, IP and standardization and deployment. To ensure the openness is also referred to as one of important issues. And with consideration for the hurdles and costs that must be overcome to implement next generation network, it says the necessity to promote collaborative efforts among domestic players and with global partners through sharing these visions. As for global collaboration, it emphasized the importance to create international collaboration frameworks with strategic partners and engage in international joint R&D and standardization from an early stage. Last December, we established Beyond 5G Promotional Consortium Japan, and also together with industry and academia. And Beyond 5G New Business Strategy Center on IP and standardization. We also plan to hold Beyond 5G International Conference in the latter half of this year to deepen international cooperation. And so we expect and highly appreciate attendance from the US as well there for embodying the concept of Beyond 5G and drawing a blueprint for future international collaboration.
Okay, that's good. And we'll come back to that, but I want to bring the other panelists in. So let me go to John first as the author of the report, to give sort of an overview of how you approach the report. In particular, I think you focused on there were two sort of big sections on emerging countries and emerging technologies. And can you give us a sense of how you approach that, those two different sets of emerging issues?
Sure, thanks, Matt. So, I think the 5G story so far has been largely, not exclusively, but largely a story among advanced economies. And so as we look forward, as we're looking to 2030 and even beyond, this is a global story. And one of the observations that this report starts with is that about half of the world still doesn't have reliable access to the internet. And so when you're thinking about all of the people who stand to benefit from joining these global networks, I think there's a real opportunity to use some of the technologies we look at, some of the emerging technologies in this report, to help close the digital divide, and not just connectivity for the sake of connecting people, but really helping people join the global economy, to participate in it, benefit from it, And so as we look to 2030, we are looking at global networks that we think are going to be more urban because the world's going to be more urban. 7 out of 10 of the world's people are going to live in cities. We know that population growth is growing fastest in Asia and Africa. So those are 2 of the key regions we look at in this report. We're looking at the Internet of Things arriving in a really big way. According to Cisco, there's going to be 500 billion devices connected by 2030. And so those 2 trends, the urbanization trend and the Internet of Things, opens opportunities to really improve our urban environments. So that's why we focus on smart cities as a very important development. There's also technology advances in photonics that are going to make networks significantly faster and potentially more efficient, more energy efficient. But all of this is going to depend on meeting several really big challenges. And we try to be honest about that in the report as well. So let me just name a few of those. Really big challenge here is that we need to make sure that the environmental impact of this technology, is manageable. And, according to some estimates, ICT equipment could consume 1/5 or even higher of global electricity by 2030. So, we need to be thinking about green networks here. There's a huge need for investment. This is part of a broader infrastructure story, but it's true in the digital space as well. The ITU says that achieving universal internet access could cost over $400 billion. And then the last challenge I mentioned is complexity. I think all of these new systems do bring with them, a period of trial and refinement and scaling further. And so I think we need to think about ways to provide technical capacity to really maximize the benefits of these systems and minimize, any unintended consequences. So we offer a few recommendations in the report to try to address some of those challenges.
Let me come back to the recommendations in a second, but first let me bring Diane in to help explain one of the key technologies here, which we've now alluded to several times, but it would be helpful to the group listening to understand a little better what is ORAN, Diane, and why is there a coalition to talk about it?
Great. Well, first, it's great to be with you all. Thank you, Matt. And I appreciate the opportunity to help roll out the Global Networks 2030. It's such an important document. And I think that the messages that we've heard over the past 20 minutes, we talked about the rollout of 5G, we've talked about looking ahead to 6G, and now we're talking about how do we digitize the rest of the world. And it all coincides, and what we need to do is be better at multitasking. And events like this, working together with government and industry partners, is such an important part of that. And my day job is focused on doing just that, but on the vendor side, OpenRAN. So OpenRAN is not a technology, it's disaggregated radio access network. It's the idea that if you standardize the interfaces at the subcomponent level, the radio, the software, the hardware, that you're able to interchange the component parts. So think of it as Lego pieces, that you can build a network based on your customer base, based on your needs. No longer do you have only a handful of companies that you can go to for your needs. You can pick and choose the different radio operators. You can pick and choose from different levels of software. And what we're going to do is we're going to drive competition at that subcomponent level, which is going to allow for greater innovation and bring down prices at the end of the day. And what we've seen, or not seen, I should say, over the past 20 years is very little investment in the telecom sector. There's been no venture capital money. And that's because the barrier for entry has been so incredibly high that if you have some new great radio units, you only have a handful of companies that you could possibly sell that to. And with a 10-year life cycle, it might not be worth your intellectual effort to actually get into that business. You might choose to go someplace else. But if you can take your radio unit and sell to a carrier, 5G is going to explode the private enterprise. If you can go direct to a company, to factory floor and sell that unit, you all of a sudden have a business case. And a business case is really going to help more rural areas as well as developing nations. No longer is governments going to have to come in and completely build a network from scratch. a company can come in, and because they have a business case, because prices, and we're hearing dropping as much as 30 to 40%, you can build out in these more rural areas, and they're able to make a go of it. So it's been an incredible year. Our 1-year anniversary is May 5th. You know, what started as 5 companies when I came into this to 31 at launch and 61 today. It's been an amazing movement where we're talking about competition and how can we use technology to solve problems that have policymakers concerned for many years now. We're not a political organization, we're an education organization, but we're focusing on the other side of that economic security issue. If not them, then who? How do we create a more diversified and robust supply chain that is going to best situate the needs of our developing economies moving forward?
Okay, that's great. Let me just follow up because you mentioned the growing concern among policymakers, and in fact, in Congress in particular here in the U.S., there's been a lot of interest in this broad topic of 5G and telecommunications networks, but specifically in ORAN, OpenRAN. And it was included explicitly in the last Defense Authorization Act last year. What does that do, and how helpful is that? Where is I've forgotten the amount of money that's being put behind this, but what is government's role in helping to promote this, and specifically what's that legislation going to do?
Absolutely. So we focus on 3 pillars of policy, and as you mentioned, funding is a big part of this. R&D. I believe that OpenRAN is the future, but if we're going to bring this to scale for 5G, R&D funding will go a long way in helping. International assistance goes a long way in helping with our allies around the world. Senator Mark Warner introduced legislation at the beginning of last year, 2020, the USA Telecommunications Act. It included 2 new grant programs, the Public Wireless Fund, which is funding for R&D and deployment in the United States, as well as a multilateral fund, which included funding to help allies around the world as they build out their networks using trusted choices. So those currently have not been funded. It needs to go through the appropriations process. In the United States, first we authorize and then we appropriate. So there are currently a couple of different paths of the appropriations process as possible other infrastructure packages that are going forward right now. So we see a couple of opportunities that this very important program could get funded.
Are you hopeful? Sorry, one final question, then I'll turn back to Ken Watanabe. But are you hopeful, Diane, that this is going to be part of the new infrastructure push by the Biden administration that, lo and behold, we're actually in Infrastructure Week, apparently. Finally, there's kind of a joke in Washington. People in Tokyo who don't know. We are seriously, the Biden administration is making a big commitment, talking big numbers, trillions of dollars in infrastructure investment. Do you expect this to be, or should it be, part of this this effort in the United States?
It absolutely should be. Digitization of the U.S. is a big part of infrastructure. As we move to, and you mentioned this, John, in the report, smart cities, we need to ensure that we are ready to go with 5G. So we, while we haven't heard anything, I think people are keeping things pretty close to the vest right now. We continue to educate on the benefits of OpenRAN.
Okay, Watanabe-san, but OpenRAN does have some challenges, as John mentioned, complexity, and you now have, I mean, it's sort of the existing model of kind of vertically integrated supply of the whole system, is kind of simple, even if it has its own challenges. This looks like a lot more complex system, and by the way, more sort of entry points for potential security risks. Is this something, how do you answer, how concerned are you about, or how realistic do you think OpenRAN is, given some of the challenges that John mentioned, that others have pointed out about the system, and there are other systems that you're also looking at that might be interesting as alternatives? Watanabe-san, did you hear? I just want to make sure you could hear. Yes, good. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I think diversification in the choice of vendors will enable network operators to build networks which avoid dependence on particular vendors, as Diane said. And this will help decrease the security concerns. Possible benefit of OpenRAN includes operators' enhanced flexibility in building and upgrading the networks and so on. But still, as I said, there might be challenging issues for constructing networks with multiple vendors, such as the program of integration and interface interoperability or compatibility. But efforts of industry and governments to find the solution by that it will develop security of the 5G networks. And as Japan, as I mentioned in the first remarks, we are promoting R&D, and also we are preparing some tax incentive to encourage the effort of private sector. We will find the solution.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you. John, let me just ask now, can you just summarize quickly your top level recommendations? And you're not picking a technology here, right? You're just making sort of more broader policy recommendations, right? To enable whatever technological solution works best.
Right. Yeah. And I think we're trying to take advantage of technologies, areas in which the United States and its partners and allies have comparative advantages. So, I mean, look, the first recommendation won't come as a surprise, but I think the U.S. needs to put forward its own vision for, what it wants global networks to look like in 2030. I think we're living, we're living and still learning the consequences of not having done that 10 years ago. And so Matt, you pointed out, Huawei didn't emerge overnight as a leader in 5G. I mean, this is a gradual process, and I think partially a consequence of not treating some of these activities as strategic, which obviously they have strategic implications. So the first recommendation is really to put forward a U.S. vision for global networks. I don't think we need to start from scratch. Thankfully, I think there's areas to work with the emphasis on free and open Indo-Pacific. I think sustainability or resiliency are both I think worth including in that as a vision. I think that there's overlap, common interests, and common values with what the UK is talking about with its plans for 2030, what Japan is talking about with its plans for beyond 5G. And so, I think we need to put something forward that benefits middle-class Americans, that aligns with our allies, and that really appeals to developing markets. And so we have a whole set of recommendations for, that are made in with the goal of appealing to those key markets. I'll just mention two of them. One of them is to view those key regional anchor markets like Indonesia and Southeast Asia, or Kenya and Nigeria and Africa, to view them as partners and not just customers. And I think, we see some companies doing this work already. One of the really fun things about doing this report was talking with people who are pursuing projects in places that you probably, didn't think a US or a Japanese company was active building networks, but they are. And I think, there's some promising developments where you have companies doing joint labs, in India or Indonesia. And I think that's important. Also their potential for positive supply chain security benefits from that. So that's one recommendation. Another one is to make technical assistance part of any allied offering as a default, basically, not as sort of an add-on that we do occasionally, but something that's a default and something that happens early on in the sort of project life cycle, so that decision makers in these key markets have the information they need, the technical capacity they need to make sound decisions. And this is not a one-way street where it's just sort of teaching happening from one set of countries to another, but I think there's an opportunity here to connect these developing markets who are going to be experimenting with these technologies themselves, learning their own lessons, and to have them share those lessons with each other, to basically say, here's what's working for us in this environment, and to benefit from that as well. So that's probably only a quarter of what's in there. So I encourage people to read the full thing. But I think hopefully that gives you a sense of it.
Great, thanks. That's helpful. And the full report is, I think, on the event page that you used to link in here. So feel free to download. Also, it was put into the chat by Macy. If you have access to the chat, which I think people do, I'm never quite sure what people have access to in a webinar, but if you do, it's in there. Speaking of the chat, we are starting to get some questions. We welcome other questions. So if you have questions, please either put them in the chat or press the Q&A button, and you can introduce a question there. In a way, following up from that, John, there's a question here from Rob at UCLA Law. Congratulations, by the way, on the basketball success so far there, which is good for my bracket, by the way. But thank you to the panelists, Rob says, and he's asking basically a question about countries, third countries that are being, in a way, put in the awkward position of having to choose between an offering from China, from a vertical vendor like Huawei, versus, a Japanese or U.S. alternative that maybe isn't quite so well defined. And so how do you communicate with those countries, to look at this as a choice between China and the United States, frankly? Maybe John or whoever wants to take that on.
Sure. So I think, just one aspect of this that I think, the U.S. can improve on and do better is, yes, we want to educate decision makers about the risks of, untrusted technology and the financial cost that comes with those risks too. I think people sometimes think, oh, it's just a security issue, but those can have really significant economic ramifications. That should be, you should try to price that into your decision, your cost benefit analysis. But I think we need to do a more compelling job of selling the benefits of our own alternatives, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the advertised benefits that decision makers are going in on a set of technology for, whether it's a smart city system or a network, for wireless. And so I think we need to first have the alternatives. We do in some of these areas. And I think in smart cities in particular, we could put together a very compelling allied smart city package and have that be implicitly different from what China's doing. But the power of having that alternative is that you get to spend all your time talking about the benefits of your alternative. And so I think we need to be in that mindset as we compete, and to not be afraid to compete.
Okay, helpful. Diane, there's a question for you, which I hope is sort of one that you're able to answer, which is, are there any recommendations to help make the bidding process more economical, both for spectrum and other 5G infrastructure?
Yes, spectrum is getting incredibly expensive. The C-band auction netted $81 billion just a couple of months ago. So, the price to assemble a network is getting increasingly more expensive, which is for the developing nations is their top concern. When I was in the U.S. government and talked to my counterparts around the world and asked why they would choose one vendor over another, and it was always cost. But I think, John, you made some great points 2 questions ago about different things that we can be doing. How can we be seen as a partner? How can we work together on whether it be technical specifications or ensuring that not only their networks get assembled but are able to get service? These are things that they're concerned about. So we need to ensure that we are seen more as a partner instead of just saying, you shouldn't do this. As far as other bidding, it's so important, especially the work that I'm doing, the cost aspect of it. How can we ensure we're driving additional competition, which will lower prices at the end of the day? Because you're right, we need to ensure that not only are we building out 5G in the developed world, but as John's paper appropriately notes, the developing nations, they're still struggling to get 2G, 3G. So
Right.
These issues aren't going away anytime soon.
Right. I was going to, if I had time, come back to that question of, a lot of places are still dealing with 2G, 3G, at best 4G, And are we leapfrogging a little too fast? But before I do that, we've got some good questions coming in. And maybe Watanabe-san, there's a question here about international standards for 5G, and kind of, it's a general question about what is the situation regarding international standards for 5G, but maybe make it more precise by saying, where can Japan and the United States most usefully collaborate to help promote better international standards, or more preferred standards from our point of view? What are the issues or the ways that we can do that? You're muted,
Yeah.
There you go. Now I can hear you. Yep.
I think to building up the standards mainly depends on the efforts of private companies, but we as a government should create a good environment for their activities, and we will coordinate the policy or target for the standardization through the dialogue between government and also involving the private sectors. And some Japanese companies, operators, and vendors are committed to open networks and willing to contribute to vendor diversification through their experience. And they are keen to contribute to the international standardization with their experience and knowledge. So, and we'd like to, and they are trying to cooperate with U.S. companies. So, Japan as a government would like to help their activity by developing good environment for their activity together with the United States government.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up, Watanabe-san? You know, a couple of weeks ago, the leaders of Japan, the United States, India, and Australia met in something called the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And this is the first time leaders had ever met. And they, among other things, they announced a new working group on emerging and critical technologies. And is this topic something that, I don't know whether you're involved in those conversations about what's going to be talked about in that group, but is that the kind of forum in which cooperation on standard setting, on other aspects of the 5G story could be usefully promoted with and expanded beyond just US and Japan to other countries like Australia, India, and potentially others? Is this an appropriate topic for that forum to discuss? Or are they planning? Oops, yeah, there we go. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the question. As you said, new Quad is a significant framework, and the establishment of a working group on technology is a very encouraging process for us. And actually, topics are not decided yet, but we can explore the possibility to include the topics like you said. But in any case, we'd like to devote ourselves to produce good output here. And at the same time, it is also essential to deepen discussion and cooperation in multilateral frameworks such as G7, OECD, APEC, ITU, with different goals and aims. And again, for the cooperation in communication technology and standardization setting, it is also vital to discuss in industry-led frameworks like our alliance or 3GPP. It is indispensable to consider how to facilitate the promotion of cooperation between public and private sectors as well. So we'd like to continue to work with the US government and private sectors as this matter as well.
Okay, excellent. We only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to take maybe one or maybe two more questions, and then I'm going to let each of the speakers, if there's anything additional that you want to say that we haven't talked about, I'll give you 1 minute each at the very end. But first of all, someone asked a question about what in the industry structure impeded greater investment in telecommunications equipment over the past 10 years? And how do you see policies breaking those barriers? Now, that's kind of a slightly backward-looking question about the past. It's interesting, but let me flip it to a more future-oriented question. To what extent should we be concerned about lessons, or what lessons might have been learned from that experience in the past that we might apply to future development, whether it's OpenRAN or some other technology? Is the problem in the private sector? Is the problem, and are there sort of issues the private sector needs to be more involved in addressing? Are there problems the government policy either hindered or didn't encourage the right kinds of investments? Anybody want to sort of draw lessons from that experience to apply sort of to how we should go forward in the future? I don't know whether Diane or John. Diane.
So I would say that I think that we've gotten to this place because of mergers and consolidation, as well as we're on a 10-year life cycle for every time we've hit another G, from 4G to 5G. So now as we look to deploy 5G, the question is, how do we ensure a robust supply chain? The concept of standardizing the interfaces where you're going to drive competition at the subcomponent level has very much gained steam. I will say, you know, as a coalition, we are technology agnostic. We're not saying there should be hardware, software solution. We just believe that there needs to be more choice, and we believe that this is the right way to do this.
Okay.
Matt, if I could add just one thing to that as well, you know, I think one of the lessons we've learned, I think, frankly, I mean, there was a company called Lucent that was an American technology that used to make some things. There was a company called Nortel that was a Canadian/North American. They had a lot of jobs in the U.S. too. Company that used to make things, and I think there was this sort of we'll let the markets decide approach that resulted in them not doing this anymore. And that was, I think, that approach, that thinking reflected didn't reflect the idea that this is a strategic sector. And so I think we've learned that lesson at a pretty high cost. I also think, we hear a lot about intellectual property theft and state subsidies on the Chinese side. And that's an important part of the story too, in thinking about how, all of the state support that has gone into China's champions. But there's also this story that I don't think gets as much attention, which is about how Chinese companies went to overlooked markets. And they learned there, and they were willing to take risks, in part because they had the state support to do so. But they were willing to go and connect places that were frankly overlooked by well-established providers. And so I think the lesson there too is that we need to care about these emerging markets. We can't just sort of hunker down and have this be, a club of advanced economies, advanced democracies. That alone won't work.
Okay, that may be your sort of closing statement, but I'll give you another chance after Diane, and then you, and then Watanabe-san. If there's anything final you want to say, let me just say there were some other very good questions, including an important one about, it was sort of in a way about Taiwan and the risks to Taiwan, but I interpret it as a kind of broader question about supply chain vulnerabilities, given the semiconductor shortages right now. We just have this problem in the Suez Canal. It shows how potentially supply chain issues are very important to this story. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to explore this here. It's a topic that we're very interested in and have been doing work on at CSIS across a number of different programs. So we won't be able to get that. But Diane, do you want to say anything final before we close? And then John, and then Watanabe-san.
Yeah, and I see a question that I'm going to actually answer as my closing. How can technology influence diplomacy? A big part of what we do at the coalition is that we want to make sure that we are communicating with our international allies around the world. And that is one of the most important component parts of this. Will technology influence diplomacy? Or diplomacy influence technology? It really goes hand in hand. As we move to the fourth industrial revolution, as it's been called, we need to ensure that we're able to work with our allies on technical specifications, on competition, and helping the more developing nations around the world to ensure that they are moving to connectivity as well.
Well,
So-
I'm not sure that this is exactly what the questioner had in mind, but I mentioned the Quad or this event. Technology is definitely facilitating conversations that are otherwise quite difficult, even though enjoyable to have in person. So I think diplomacy is in some ways facilitated by this technology, but that may or may not have been what the questioner was getting at. John, do you want to say anything finally?
I think I've said enough. Thanks.
Okay. And Watanabe-san? Any final words?
Yeah, thank you. We also established a Beyond 5G strategy, taking into account past lessons from 5G and previous generations, and also taking into account supply chain matters, and also global situations. And today, I think we got a lot of valuable comments and inputs and interesting questions. So I'd like to thank all of you for those precious comments. And finally, I'd like to say thank you again, CSIS, for giving us precious chances by hosting the series of roundtables. So MIC would like to keep contact with CSIS and OpenRAN Coalition and all of your relevant people. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, Kochira koso in Japanese, back at you, the same sentiment that we thank you for your participation, your support for this effort, but also we want to keep the channel open. These reports, we like to keep living documents, and they continue to evolve, and we don't want to just end with a report that then ends the conversation. These are important issues, and they're evolving quickly, and we certainly at CSIS want to keep the channel open, and we'd like to keep MIC and the OpenRAN Alliance and other partners and experts involved in this conversation. So thank you to you, Watanabe-san. Thank you to Diane. Thank you to John. The report is online. It's on the chat. We will have a tape of this conversation up within the next 48 hours and on the CSIS website. And I think with that, we can close out. Thank you very much. Thanks to friends in Japan for getting up so early. And have a good day and good evening to everyone here in the United States. Bye-bye.